Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. Hope you're having a great time. I know I am. By far the best version of Ignite so far, I think. Who agrees? Oh, come on, more. Yeah, that's it. Except for the food. Okay, so let's not go there. My name is Michael, Michael van Horenbeek, or better known as Van Hybrid, because some time ago, about 6 years, even a little bit longer, I found myself doing a lot of hybrid deployments, and because my name is unpronounceable for anyone who is non-Flemish or Dutch, they just said, we're going to call you Van Hybrid, it's so much easier. I'm not working for Microsoft, unlike most of the presenters at Ignite, which means that I can be quite frankly about the things that we encounter out in the wild. This is what the session is about today. Talk to you about how things are, not how they are supposed to be, but literally the itty-nitty details about how you can find them out open in the wild. Now, interestingly enough, I found myself today a little bit in a pickle. Whom of you attended this session this morning? Okay. So for those who did not attend this session, I sincerely suggest that you go and watch the video, because there were a ton of announcements. Pretty much my entire slide deck thrown away. Because I'm going to talk about stuff that is broken today, and Microsoft talked this morning about how they're going to fix all of that in the next few months. Some of it will take a little bit longer. Now, there's one thing. Today, it's all promises. So until they deliver, we're still living with what I'm going to talk about. So whatever I say is still valid. Yay. So first, let's set the scene a little bit about what I mean by talking hybrid. Just a few minutes so that we're all on the same page, right? Someone on the internet once said that hybrid is the approach where, enterprise computing, or computing in a whole, is where an organization uses resources on-prem and in the cloud, right? This is a very broad term of what hybrid IT is. And the cloud could be, any cloud. When talking about hybrid exchange, we're obviously talking about an Exchange server on premises, which today can still be Exchange 2010, 2013, 2016, and soon even Exchange 2019. Well, maybe not that soon, but anyway. So we have that Exchange server on premises, and then we will connect that up to the cloud. We're not talking about AWS or Azure. We're talking about Office 365. So hybrid exchange, for me, is an organization that went through the motions of setting that up, right? Just so that we're all clear. So you went through the motions of running the hybrid configuration wizard. And there's two reasons to do so, right? Some organizations choose to do so while maintaining the exchange organization for the foreseeable future. Some organizations tend to do that forever, or at least that's the plan for now. I have customers tell me, for the next 5 years, we'll be in that hybrid mode, and it is a deliberate decision, and that is fine. I know that Microsoft talks a lot about set up hybrid, move everything to the cloud, and be done with it. Well, that is a very romantic view. I know that some of you here have the plan to move to the cloud, and in 5 years, you're still moving. Or maybe some mailboxes will just stay on premises because some things can't move legally, technically, whatever the reason is. And then you've got the organizations that use the hybrid configuration wizard to facilitate a full move to the cloud in a short period of time. Now, these are two very different things within the hybrid exchange space. One of which is full hybrid, and the other one is the minimal hybrid, an option that we got last year, the minimal hybrid configuration, or even an express migration, which is somewhat part of that as well. Today, we're going to talk about full hybrid, mainly, right? The coexistence issues that you will have. And the session is somewhat divided in two things. Hybrid, what it is, what the problems are, how you can work around these problems. And then we're going to shift into, well, what if you have hybrid in the long term? And for that, I'm going to use an example of a virtual organization that is in a coexistence scenario with multiple or multiple subsidiaries, some of which use Exchange, some of which might be using Office 365. It's a theoretical example that touches on a lot of items which are open in the wild. Some of you have Lotus Notes. Some of you use Gmail. Some of you have another third-party provider for email or coexistence with some mergers and acquisitions, and that's the second part of the presentation that we're going to talk about. So let's dive into some of the common questions, right? I'm not going to talk about how to set up hybrid. That's basically just running a wizard. Takes you 2 minutes and you're done. Literally, it's that easy. But some of the things around running that hybrid configuration. So for the long term, it means that you're going to have an Exchange server on premises. And you'll have to patch that server. And you'll have to make sure that it coexists with whatever you have up in Office 365. But how do you even keep up with the fast pace of the cloud? Now, maintaining that on-premises server, and we'll talk about that in just a bit, is quite easy. Every quarter there is a cumulative update, which, if you do it right, you should apply that cumulative update within a few weeks from it being released, so that you are current on your release. From a supportability point of view, also the best thing that you can do. What I'm talking about is the difference in pace between on-premises and in the cloud. If you are in hybrid, but you have moved all your mailboxes to the cloud, you're at a single pace from an end-user experience, from a functionality experience. But if you are in a hybrid deployment with, let's say, 50% on-premises and 50% in the cloud, and you're going to stay that way, then whomever is in the cloud today will have, very candidly, a very better experience from an end-user perspective. There is so much more they can do in Office 365. But it doesn't mean that you have to neglect whom is on premises. And what we have learned this week, at least I have, is that Microsoft is moving really fast, adding cool stuff in the cloud, and not everything is coming back on premises. So this is, for you as an organization, something to come and think about. How are you going to deal with the change management there? How are you going to make sure that you do not forget about your on-premises users? And obviously, at some point, they'll come to you and be like, well, we want to do that stuff as well. And some of that will trickle back to on-premises, but some of that won't. How are you going to organize support around that? Is it the same team that is going to manage Office 365? Because when we're talking about Exchange and Exchange Online, it's pretty much the same thing. It's in essence, it's an Exchange server in the cloud, if you will. Obviously, there's differences. But once you move your mailbox to the cloud, you get in touch with new functionalities, groups, teams. There's SharePoint Online, and it's all so interconnected that it is very difficult for someone who has always only been doing Exchange to take on that additional load. So how are you going to deal with that? Those are all common questions that you will run into, things that you will have to deal with once you go in a long-term hybrid. In a short-term hybrid, it's just for a few weeks, a few months maybe at most. But if you're going to do that for 5 years, these are realistic problems that you'll have to deal with. And some of you might be able to do all that, some of you might not be able to do that, but at least it should not be an afterthought. Where will your data be stored? The multi-geo we're going to come back later to, but it's important today until multi-geo becomes available and until you meet the requirements, if there are any, and until you've decided that you want to do something like that. The tenant region where your data is stored is where the data will be for everyone, even if subsidiaries live outside of that region. Let's say that you've got a European tenant and you've got a headquarter in the US. I've seen it happen. Then the data will live in Europe. Or if you have an office over in Asia, the data today will live in Europe. That's one of the reasons why some of my customers remain hybrid, because they'll keep Exchange servers in those locations where they cannot move data to the cloud. And how will that impact the end user experience for the users over there? Right? What's the latency like? How is coexistence like? Talking about coexistence for Office 365 groups, which isn't too bad, is something to think about, right? Because if you are on premises, you do not get the full experience of an Office 365 group as someone is in the cloud. So again, these are all little things that can make a big, big difference. And last but not least, while setting up that hybrid or hybrid in the long term, there is security. That security guy that always comes in and says no, well, you'll have to deal with them too. So let's look at some scenarios, right? Hybrid in itself, short-term or long-term, is not insecure. As a matter of fact, I thank Microsoft a lot for a blog post they have published a while back. It's authentication deep dive, or hybrid authentication deep dive, which explains in great detail how authentication works cross premises for auto-discover, for mailbox moves, for FreeBSD. And it has helped me explain to some of these security guys, well, look at the paper here. It's proof that it is not inherently insecure as you have suggested earlier. Now you'll get pushback anyhow, right? That's just because it is. But that is a very great starting point. Now, if you have been to Jeff's session this morning, you know that Microsoft is working on a solution where you might not have to open up inbound ports into your Exchange environment. Now, there's not many details and it isn't available yet. But then again, definitely go watch his session to find out what they are doing there, because this might be a problem of the past in the future. See what I did there? Anyway, this is especially true for organizations I'm going to call a vertical, finance. They are by far the hardest to deal with. No, we're not publishing Autodiscover. No, we're not publishing EWS. And everything is a no. For some of these no's, you have a solution. Could you go hybrid without doing auto-discovery externally? The answer is technically yes, which before I continue brings me to a very different point I want to make. Technically, everything can be solved. There is rarely not a technical solution for a problem. The sky is literally the limit. It's not because you can solve something technically, it's not because you can hack your way around something that it is a good idea to do so. So again, coming back to this example here, can you go hybrid without publishing Autodiscover? Yeah, you can hack your way around and make it work. Would I suggest that you do? No, absolutely not, because the experience will not be that great. Setting up the hybrid configuration, you'll run into your first issue right then and there. Well, error message. And that continues to cascade. Plus, we'll always have to keep in mind that whatever functionality is added just assumes that the endpoint is available, right? So yanking that out, taking away that capability maybe solves one problem, like your endpoint information not being discoverable, although I'm pretty sure that for the majority of the organizations, it will be mail.mydomain.com, so I've got the endpoint anyway, without even having to query Autodiscover. But it's not because you solve one problem that you don't create another one, which is really important because hybrid moves along. Today, you can build a hybrid deployment on an assumption that something will work hacking your way around. What guarantee do you have that tomorrow there will not be a feature that is released which requires Autodiscover, which you just did not disclose on the internet? And all of a sudden, you're in a sort of catch-22. Well, I did X to solve problem Y. Microsoft decided to roll out a feature, and now I'm in problem Z. That's not the situation you want to be in. So yes, I strongly urge you to stay current with all the guidances and try and work around the limitations you have rather than implement a technical workaround. So when you are looking at securely publishing Exchange, the problems that you run into today is, first of all, the endpoint is on the internet, but let's just assume for argument's sake that you've gotten past the point where you're not allowed to publish that endpoint, so you can publish that endpoint. Well, a lot of organizations, and I understand why, they want to make sure that only traffic from Exchange Online is allowed. Great. Microsoft has an XML file or even an RSS feed where you can find all the IP addresses that you need to allow inbound connections into your environment. Okay, how hard could it be to set up an access control list on a firewall with hundreds of IP addresses? First of all, it's a lot of work, especially if the firewall guy doesn't know how to do that in bulk, but that's his problem, not mine. I know. But on the other hand, you need to maintain those lists as well. So will it work? Yes. Is it a great experience? Well, if you maintain those lists, no. But it basically means that someone needs to keep an eye on whenever a new IP address is added. And it's good. It doesn't change every other day. But yes, IP addresses do change. Microsoft does publish new IP addresses once in a while, which means that you have to upgrade those access control lists. And the way that they come back to bite you in the royal behind is when you start getting these calls. Well, yesterday it worked and today it doesn't work. And then 5 minutes later, he calls back, man, it's okay, it seems to work again. You get these calls where there is intermittent connectivity. Well, chances are that sometimes a connection isn't allowed and the connection comes in from a different IP address and all of a sudden it's not allowed anymore. And those are not easy to troubleshoot. So the longer you are in hybrid, the more likely you're going to run into those issues, right? So keep that in mind, that it can be definitely very hard to maintain those access control lists. Now, straying a little bit away from security perspective, if you are in a large hybrid scenario, even if you're in a medium-sized hybrid deployment, then you want to move mailboxes as fast as possible. And obviously, there is a lot of things that come into play there, one of which is the network configuration. There's a few great sessions this week, I think it was on Tuesday, given by Jeff Mealy and his colleague, on how to design the network or how to optimize your network connectivity, internet connectivity for Exchange Hybrid or for Office 365 in general. I strongly suggest that you take a look at that session too, because it applies to everything that you do in hybrid. Now, FreeBusy and AutoDiscover are not the workloads that are going to hit you hard. Those are not the workloads that are going to cause slow clients and so forth. What is going to hit you hard during mailbox moves is the fact that if you use a single endpoint to publish to the internet through a load balancer, you will see that, as Exchange is designed to do, the client access server or service gets the requests through the load balancer, and proxies it to the mailbox server where the mailbox lives that you're trying to move, and then a second request comes in for the same move. Your load balancer says, if you set it up the way that Microsoft suggests it, I'll pass it on to a different client access service. And the third request goes to yet another one, and yet another one, and yet another one. And while that is great for general client connectivity, if you've got thousands of requests hitting you for a mailbox move, you might find out that your mailbox move is delayed because of all the proxying going on in the back. So in order to improve that experience, that mailbox move speed, what you should do is try and publish multiple endpoints onto the internet, which means one IP address or multiple IP addresses, which is tied to a single backend client access server. And that will then go to a mailbox server in the back, but it will maintain that connection from that client access server without going back and forth. That is a quick win and sometimes has a huge impact. Now, this being said, none of this is useful if your network is still horribly wrong designed, right? And there, the one tenet I can give you as a tip: reduce latency. How you do it really depends on how you design your network, but reducing latency is all about reducing hop count. Increasing bandwidth is one thing, but if your bandwidth is 2 gigs to the internet, let's say, that's pretty good connectivity, and you go through 60 hops to get somewhere, it'll still be a pretty shitty experience. So drive down that hop count, and you can do that by talking to your ISP. Which brings me into very dark waters, because I sometimes get the question from a customer, okay, so we want to drive down the hop count. Ooh, I've heard about this thing called ExpressRoute. I want to do ExpressRoute. I'll give you my version, and then I'll give you the more nuanced version. No, is my version. No. The more nuanced version is, yes, there are use cases where ExpressRoute can help, but not from a performance perspective, right? And that is something to understand. Even more so, if I were to work internally in a company and the question would come in, should I do ExpressRoute or not for hybrid? I'm not talking about any other workloads. Let's talk about hybrid for a second. My first question would be to look at my network team and ask myself, would I trust them with something so complex as ExpressRoute from a management perspective? If I know they've got all their ducks in a row, and those are pros, they know exactly everything there is to know about the network and routing, and they're aces in troubleshooting and stuff, I might consider saying yes. If, however, my experiences with my network team are not that great, then I would be in a big doubt, just because of how that works. Now, we're not going to go into detail because some of the other sessions go into detail about ExpressRoute and the pros and the cons and where you need to think about, but that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. So when publishing multiple endpoints, as I said, every connection is proxied through a different client access server, therefore maintaining some sort of affinity, right? Could you set up your default publishing and then just maintain affinity based on source IP? That is something that you could do as well. But then doing that on your general published endpoint on the internet, if you publish it on the internet, then takes away the benefit you have, or takes away some of the high availability theoretically, or some of the benefits that you have from the flexibility where you can just hit one CAS or the other without regards of where your mailbox is, right? Anyway, you are in hybrid, yay. And maybe a quick show of hands. Who was in hybrid, or who went hybrid with Exchange 2010? Wow, that's a fair number of you. Who remembers having to rerun the hybrid configuration wizard very regularly? An equal amount of hands, yeah, okay. Luckily, that's not the case anymore if you have run the new hybrid configuration wizard. So there's only a few use cases. When you make a modification to your transport configuration, i.e., when you run the hybrid configuration wizard, you have to configure a few source transport servers from where traffic is sent to Office 365. If you add or remove a server that is in that list, you need to rerun the hybrid configuration wizard. If your transport certificate, the one that you use for hybrid mail flow, changes or expires and you have to roll the certificate, run the hybrid configuration wizard. If you add or remove domains that you want to use in your hybrid configuration, I can add as many accepted domains into my on-premises organization and not need to rerun the hybrid configuration wizard. But as soon as I move one of these recipients to the cloud, as soon as I want to make that email address addressable in the cloud or from the cloud to on-premises, I need to rerun the HTW. That's pretty clear. You don't need to run it every quarter. So after updating your on-premises server, no need to rerun the HTW. You don't need to make any change or need to rerun the HTW if you make any other change. If you add a mailbox server just for that, that's fine. If you don't intend to add that mailbox server to the source transport servers for routing to and from Office 365, that's fine as well. If you make changes to your client access configuration, you're okay. No need to rerun the HTW. How about upgrading? So of all the people that said we went hybrid with 2010, who is still on hybrid 2010 today? Wow, that's a fair number. Okay. So I'm pretty sure you've already had the question, or maybe you have the question, do I need to upgrade to 2010 or 2013 or 16 or soon to come 2019? Well, here's a quick workflow. If you're happy today and everything works and you're not missing out on anything, just stay where you are. It is still supported, so that's fine. And essentially, unless you have mailboxes hosted on those servers, it's just a management tool anyway. Right, until Microsoft solves the problem of removing that lost server. So stay on 2010. Are you not happy? The question is, why are you unhappy? If you've got some problems outside of work, then fix those first. If you've got some problems that are actually related to the technology, then dive into those problems. First of all, what's the purpose of your upgrade, or why would you want to do hybrid, right? That's the core scenario that you want to ask. And the related problems, by the way, all too often I come somewhere and they're like, oh, we're trying to move to the cloud as quickly as possible because that DAG, that just doesn't do it very well. That would scare the hell out of me. I mean, that's like production data sitting right there. Fix that first. If the fix for you is to upgrade to 2013, by all means do so. You're going to go to an essential double hop migration, which increases the amount of work that you have to put in there, but that's not necessarily what you're after, right? Anyway, what's the purpose of your hybrid configuration? Long-term coexistence, in this case, move mailboxes off of 2010, and then you can upgrade. Is the purpose just migration? Do the same thing. Move the mailboxes from 2010 up to the cloud, and then upgrade, because the upgrade becomes so much easier if there is no more workload, or if the workload is smaller, which means mailboxes, the amount of mailboxes that you're still hosting on premises. As I alluded to earlier, in some scenarios, I've seen where it is easier to solve the problem they have with the current implementation of Exchange by just ripping and replacing it with a new version, which means move to 2013, 2016 on premise, then do all the hybrid stuff and move mailboxes. But just keep in mind it's more work for you. Anyway, some common mistakes, things that are open in the wild, some issues that you will run into as well. You just moved to Exchange Online, you are in long-term hybrid, but mainly everyone is in the cloud. You're out there partying, you're like, yeah, raise the roof, great. And then the question that burns everyone, do I need to keep that Exchange server? Funny enough, I was 2 or 3 weeks back, some customer in Belgium, we were having a workshop about identity, which essentially is the root of all evil here. And they were like, okay, so we're going to move mailboxes, and I'm going to decommission this. And in the midst of their train thought, I was like, oh, hold on for a second. You said remove all the servers. I'm like, well, you're going to have to keep that Exchange server. They were flabbergasted because they've already ordered it to be removed, and they were like, well, no, we don't want that. We don't want to keep that. So, what is the problem? Identity. When you go hybrid, there's a few attributes that get synced up into the cloud, and there's a few attributes that get synced back to the cloud. And once you go hybrid, and it's not hybrid itself, running the HEW won't cause this problem. It's setting up Azure AD Connect that causes this problem, because as soon as you do so, the source of authority of certain objects related to Exchange Online is on premises, which means they're read-only in Azure AD Connect or in Azure AD. As such, what you will find if you have a mailbox in the cloud and you go to the cloud management tools and you try changing something there, it'll tell you, nah, sorry, can't do that. You'll have to do that on premises. For some of us on premises, yes, we could hack our way using ADSI edit and then change some attribute types here and there, but for all seriousness, that is not supported. The only supported way to make changes to certain recipient types and so forth is using the management tool designed to do that, which is Exchange. Yes, we call it Exchange Server, but if you just keep that server around for management purposes, then it becomes a glorified management tool. You don't even need to run it on physical hardware. I think that Ross will even agree to that. Just virtualize the thing, right? It's a management tool like any other. You don't have to design it with 16 gigs of RAM and 24 CPUs, just exaggerating to make my point here. But it's no more than a management tool. I understand the frustration, and again, session this morning, Jeff said that he's fixing this problem. ETA not really known. I thought he said 12 to 18 months, but at least we know that eventually this problem will go away. For reference, if you're still planning to go hybrid, or if you are hybrid, there is a little table that you can always refer to later. I'm not going to go over that in detail. So, why do you want to keep that Exchange server around? We know that we have to from a recipient management perspective, so that's one thing. But let's face it. Most organizations, they move to the cloud. They're very happy there. But what if? It's like an insurance. What if I want to move back on premises? Well, if you want to do that at some point in the future, then you'll need something to host those mailboxes. Could you remove the Exchange server and reinstall them? Yeah, sure, that works too. But having that server there gives you that warm, fuzzy feeling, knowing that you can still move back in a matter of minutes. And actually, this is something I tell most of my customers as well, once they're moving to the cloud, or they start their migrations. It used to be the idea that you want to plan out everything, like create migration batches and know that during a migration batch, no cross-premises permission is broken and everything works fine, and you've tested everything, which means that you start planning today, and in a year from now, you'll have moved 15 mailboxes, just because you want to make sure that everything is great. In my opinion, the worst way to move. I like the agile approach. Set up hybrid today, move the first mailbox. Don't move your CEO. Bad idea. Bad idea. Move your mailbox. Start using it. See what breaks. Obviously, there's a few things that you know up front that will break. And obviously, there is a few things that you don't want to break that you can fix up front. But for everything else, just move the mailbox. And if something really, really, really important breaks, move it back. Fix the problem and move it up again. And do that over, rinse and repeat. Take a bunch of users that work together, move them to the cloud, create a pilot community within your own organization and move them. You will see that, in a matter of fact, the majority will not have so many problems, and the problems they have are not blocking. And at the same time, you are moving ahead, and you will be moving 2, 3, even 4 times faster than if you try to plan out every little detail. Now, it goes in against the nature of most organizations because they want to control everything, but it is the better approach because you have this flexibility. Another reason to keep that Exchange server around is relaying. I think we can all agree that we have some sort of multifunctional device that can scan documents and send them over SMTP somewhere. And a lot of these devices are that old, or the technology is that old, that they cannot even do authenticated SMTP. Or we don't know how to configure it, or the maintenance contract expired. Whatever the reason is, we need a easy relay into Office 365. Well, the hybrid server is just there for you to do that. Point those devices, or whatever application it is, to your Exchange server, create a receive connector with an IP address list that allows them to send to Exchange, and they can relay up to the cloud to your users without having to open additional firewall ports. That's an important one as well. So while it's there, you can use it for that purpose, and you don't need to hack your way around by creating an SMTP gateway in IIS with all sorts of IP address lists as well, and where you have to configure a user that then does authenticated SMTP to Office 365, which is an option as well. But while you have that Exchange server, use it for what it's worth, right? And of course, hybrid public folders, those pesky public folders. Who still has public folders? I'm going to try that again. I don't want to see that many hands. Wow. Pesky public folder. Yeah, so reality is, I know, a lot of us still use them. If you're moving to the cloud, it's a great time to actually get rid of them. I was able to convince one of my customers to not go hybrid with public folders, i.e. move the mailboxes and tell them once you're moved, they're gone. It was okay, the experience, but they were able to finally get past the fact that they have public folders. There's lots of things that you can do, right? If you go into Office 365, you can actually move them to the cloud. You can configure them in a hybrid deployment so that cloud users point to on-premises public folders or vice versa. That in itself is not the greatest experience. It works. Technically, it works. But it's not something I want to put all my users through unless I have no other option. So if you move everyone up, try moving those public folders as quickly as possible and not stay into an indefinite, I want to stay on premises with hybrid public folders. Even if that means that you have to use third-party tools, because sometimes, especially in this case, where yes, Microsoft has the ability to help you move public folders to the cloud, some third-party vendors, in my opinion, do a much better way, give you more flexibility, right? And that's one of the points I'm going to make later is that, despite all the efforts that Microsoft is making and all the promises that we're hearing about the things that they're going to fix, which I'm very happy about, don't get me wrong, I'm really super excited. Sometimes you just, have to accept the reality that what they have is just, covering certain scenarios, and you fall outside of that bucket, and you'll have to revert to custom solutions or something else. Cross-premises permissions. Full disclosure, at some point in the future, I think early next year, this will become something of the past, and I will be very happy. But indulge me in my thinking here for a second. The scenario is that we have someone called Sophie. She is a sales director, and her mailbox has been moved to the cloud. The IT guy, Mike, is very happy and says, well, I'll start moving mailboxes to the cloud so I can go out and raise the roof, as you saw earlier. A day later, though, Sophie is not very happy. She lost a client because that client called her early in the morning. She wasn't available because she was in a meeting, and her assistant wasn't able to view FreeBusy or get calendaring information or book the meeting altogether. Problem. Very realistic, but indulge me for a second here. So the IT guy, not that very happy, and the vacation he was dreaming of, gone, because he'll soon be out of a job, worst case scenario. But what happened here? Well, it's a problem that we have today still. Full mailbox access cross-premises works just fine, so that's okay. You can move a mailbox and have full mailbox access and maintain that, even if one of the mailboxes stays on premises. But if I have delegate permissions to someone else's mailbox and my mailbox is moved to the cloud and the other one stays on premises, I have a problem. Vice versa too. This is also why, and again, that session that Jeff did this morning has a very nice image. That's where you get into a scenario where you have to create migration batches. You have to lift and shift mailboxes that are connected through permissions or delegate permissions to one another at the same time to maintain that functionality. But typically you start with one mailbox and you enumerate all the delegates, and then you get 10 new mailboxes, and then you start enumerating the delegates for those 10 mailboxes, and you get 10 times 10 other mailboxes, and that fans out to be your entire organization. I've seen it happen where we started out with one single mailbox to move and ended up with somehow this one mailbox, through delegate permissions of all the mailboxes that are connected, connect all the mailboxes in the entire organization. Which means that you would have to move them all at the same time to Office 365 in order to overcome any problems, which, depending on the size of your organization, is not feasible, right? Now, this is something, obviously, while you're migrating or while you start to migrate, early on will come and bite you in the royal behind, but this is something that while you are in hybrid and you keep having those mailboxes on premises and in the cloud, will continue to bite you, right? Do I have a solution for this? No, unfortunately not. Not even hacking your way around it, it's just accepting it. The way that you can do that from a velocity migration perspective is just, agree with the customer or your internal users that you'll, at level 3 of interconnections of mailboxes, you're going to draw a line, and that is where it will break. And that you do that to maintain a sizable batch of users that you're going to move at the same time. And often, interestingly enough, it's not technologically that is keeping you from moving mailboxes, because if you've got a big internet pipe, you can move 1,000 mailboxes a night, even 2,000. The question is your support organization ready for moving 2,000 mailboxes at night? And then on a Monday morning, figuring out there's X amount of issues. No matter how sweet the process is, how smooth the process is, how easy it is to move a mailbox, which it is, on a batch of 2,000 users, there's always going to be problems. Whether it is a password they forgot, which is not even related to moving the mailbox, whether it's Outlook not reconnecting for whatever reason it is, there's always going to be something. So the more people you move, the more issues you'll have the day after. So the limiting factor is not technologically there. The limiting factor is often the organization not able to maintain more than 250 moves a day or a week or whatever it is, depending on your organization. The hybrid mesh. Now, this is an interesting one. I call it the hybrid mess, especially if you're in a larger organization or an organization that has a lot of mergers and acquisitions. Again, financial institutions tend to do that quite a lot, is that you buy another company, you want to start collaborating with them as quickly as possible because, that's what people do. I buy them, I want to work with them, that's normal. So what happens in this scenario? We've got company A, we've got company B, and company B is in a hybrid deployment. Company A could also be in a hybrid deployment, but for argument's sake, let's just keep it very simple. A, purely on premises, B, hybrid. So Brianna in company A wants to look up FreeBSD of Timothy in company B. So what happens? I use Outlook or Outlook web app, and the request goes to the client access server asking for FreeBSD information for Timothy H at companyb.com. Great. The Exchange server looks up the recipient, knows that it is not authoritative for that recipient, and then sees, oh, I've got an organizational relationship for Timothy's organization. So I'm going to go out, go talk to the Federation Gateway. This is DAuth. We're going to talk about OAuth in just a minute. I'll get that federation token or that delegation token, and then I'm going to send out a request to Tim's Exchange server using that delegation token and ask for FreeBSD for Tim. So far, so good. Default federation, Exchange federation, that is, has nothing to do with identity federation, for all that matters. So the request comes in on that Exchange server, and the Exchange server is going to look up the recipient information for Tim. And what it will find is a mail-enabled user, which has a target address that points to the cloud. The target address in this case being timh@companyb.mail.microsoft.com. going to take that recipient information and is going to return that to the Exchange server at the other side. Do I have FreeBSD information at hand right now? No. I just have a redirect or a target address. Will the Exchange server in Brianna's organization do something with that information? No. It has no clue on how to deal with that, and it will just drop the request, if you will, and you will not get back any FreeBSD information. This, too, is a problem that will hit you, especially if you're in a long-term hybrid and have an organization that lives and moves. How do you solve this? Well, you have to solve this problem by creating what we call a hybrid mesh. So each organization, and in this case, organization is not the boundary or the legal boundary. The boundary here is each technical exchange organization must have a trust relationship with someone else, because trusts are non-transitive. So this applies to both DAuth and OAuth. Right? DAuth is what we use, the Federation Gateway in Exchange 2010, 2013, 2016. And OAuth is what by default configured in Exchange 2013 and 2016 if you use the hybrid configuration wizard. So to make that work, company A has to have an organizational relationship with company B, and company A needs to have an organizational relationship with the Office 365 tenant of company B. Then the Office 365 tenant in company B obviously must have an organizational relationship to their own company, which they have through hybrid, and they must set up the same thing for the other way around to company A. Add company C in the mix. Now company C must have an organizational relationship with company A and company B on premises and with company B in the cloud, and then company A has to have that with company and so forth and so on. So everyone must be able to look up FreeBSD independently. Plus, the recipient information needs to be exchanged on a continuous basis, because company B, I might be moving mailboxes to the cloud every day, which means that every day the recipient information changes, which means every day you need to understand that if you need to request information from my mailbox that was moved to the cloud, you should not go and talk to my on-premises server. You have to go and talk directly to the cloud. And the only way for you to do so is if the recipient information that you have for my contact reflects the actual location of my mailbox. If I'm on premises, it could be companyb.com, great. If my mailbox has moved to the cloud, then the recipient information on the contact detail in your organization should reflect michael@companyb.mail.onmicrosoft.com. If you've got 2 organizations, that's okay. If you've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to maintain, it becomes a mess, right? But it's the reality, something that you have to work with. So you'll have to manually implement some sort of synchronization between both organizations to keep that going, and then manually create the intra-organizational connectors or organizational relationships between all the involved organizations to make sure that FreeBSD can be requested, because you need to have a direct trust between all those organizations. Shifting gears from permissions to recipient management, and there's a lot of these examples, but one that I find really interesting is, how do you create a new mailbox? Theoretically, the answer is, well, you create an empty mailbox on premises and then move that empty mailbox to the cloud, and then life is great. There is an easier way. It's called the new remote mailbox commandlet, which immediately provisions a mailbox in the cloud. But you can't move the mailbox back, which kind of takes away the ability to, or support your exit strategy. Is that something that is really a problem? No, because you can use the new remote mailbox, immediately provision a mailbox in the cloud, and then take that exchange, go in and stamp it to the on-premises object manually, because it's not synced back for you, and then you will be able to move a mailbox back if you would ever like to do so. Again, if you never intend to move mailboxes back to on-premises, you shouldn't even care about this. But if you want to move mailboxes back and forth for whatever reason, this is something that will be there and that you'll have to take into account. This is for all recipient types the same thing. So as I said, first half is about some of the common issues that you will see. And now let's place those common issues and some other items into a scenario, right? Mergers and acquisitions, divestitures, very common things. So the playing field here, what I'm going to use is a holding company, and that company has multiple subsidiaries. And just because I'm very creative, I'm going to call them Company A, Company B, Company C, and Company D, right? Company A uses an Exchange 2010 on-premises. Company B has Office 365. Company C has, God forbid, Lotus Notes. And Company D uses Exchange 2016 on-prem. Okay, so far so good. So we've got a good mix of technology, old, new, and stale, and newer. Anyway, you get this scenario, and you go and talk to your customer or your CEO, and you get a bunch of requirements. They want you to set up a single global solution to improve collaboration between all subsidiaries. Of course, right? We want to work together with our colleagues all over the globe and make sure that we can do so in a very efficient way. We must keep the time to implement this as low as possible. It has to be done tomorrow, preferably even yesterday. No impact on the end user, and obviously it shouldn't cost a dime. Yeah, that's realistic, right? Oh yeah, by the way, you should show benefits as quickly as possible, because if I'm going to spend money for you to do something, I want to see a return on investment. Of course, I'm going to ask all these things just because I can. And while I'm at it, the security guy walks in and says, it needs to be secure by design. Everything you do should adhere to our standards, but also industry standards and the latest and the greatest and so forth and so on. So, where do you begin? That's the first thing I typically wonder, and that's the face I do make. Before anything else, make sure the network is up to par. I cannot stress this enough, right? Not necessarily talking about your internal network, because some organizations have a pretty flat structure as in terms of how the network looks like. Internet connectivity. If you've got multiple subsidiaries, I still see organizations, and for the reason why that is might be historical, or just because the networking team thinks that it's the best way to do so, or the security team has an influence. But I see organizations that route all internet traffic through a central hub to the internet. It can be a problem because if someone in, let's just for argument's sake take Asia, goes to Europe to break out to the internet there, all sorts of funky stuff happen, right? One of them being DNS lookups happen in Europe. So the endpoint that is returned is the endpoint in Europe, which means that your user in Asia connects to Europe to get to their data. Horrible experience. Horrible. So that you don't want to. Ideally, and I know this, it's easy for me to say, oh, just do this. There's lots of hurdles that you might have to take. But ideally, they'll have local breakout, because their experience, even if that local breakout is not as performing as the network link that is in the central location, it will be a lot better. Obviously, let's dive into the security features a little bit. Proxy servers, great. So I've got a lot of organizations that have great proxy servers there, and then they start moving mailboxes to the cloud, and you see that proxy infrastructure all of a sudden go from very performing to very poorly performing to almost breaking down at some point. Well, when you come to think of it, proxies are not used for internal traffic, which means your Outlook client using RPC HTTP or MAPI HTTPS connects to Exchange directly internally and bypasses the proxy altogether. Great. And then you move that mailbox to the cloud, which means that traffic goes to the internet, goes through the proxy server. Well, Outlook is such a great client that it doesn't make one connection, but it makes 2 or 3, and depending on the amount of calendars and shared mailboxes you have open, it makes 4, 5, 6, 7 connections. So now all of a sudden, instead of just having that one connection to the internet to open Facebook during lunch, I have 10 other connections per user, or let's even say 5 other connections per user open to the internet through that same connection. Which means that the proxy server has to do a lot more work. Plus, there's something about port mapping where internal connections are mapped from a port to the internet, which means that when you have got 65,535 theoretical ports available to make an outbound connection somewhere, and I'm using 10 of those per user, then you can make the number count yourself. There's only a limited amount of users you can support with a single external IP address. Is this a problem for large-scale enterprise deployments? Typically, it isn't. But as we've seen this morning, apparently the size for typical hybrid customers is around 105 mailboxes. Will they run into this problem? Probably not, but if you're in the range of anywhere between 2 and anything above that 1,000 mailboxes, this is something to just keep in mind. You don't want to run into that problem. And then obviously, firewalls as well. Do you have an old firewall that can only operate based on IP addresses or access control lists with an IP address? Or do you have a next-gen firewall that can actually do DNS lookups for inbound connections or even outbound connections to make their decision? Obviously, I recommend new-gen firewalls, but sometimes we have to make do with what we have. And then the question comes, in this scenario, you want to move to Office 365. Are you going to go with a single tenant, or are you going to go multi-tenant? Or are you going to wait until multi-GA becomes available and then hopefully do something there? My go-to answer, let's try a single tenant. The reason to do that is just to make your life easier. The very first requirement was we need to improve collaboration. So are you then willing to sacrifice some of the benefits you have just to have multiple tenants? Is that really something you want to chase after? Yes, Microsoft is improving the experience cross-tenant, that you have cross-tenant capabilities to improve collaboration, and perhaps even in the future move mailboxes between tenants. But that still doesn't solve all of your problems. No, it creates more problems. It actually shifts the problem from on-premises and recreates it in the cloud. So ideally, and obviously there's a lot of corner cases and there's a gray area, you want to move into that single tenant, which then creates all sorts of problems because that on-premises estate is not greenfield. It's not a single Exchange organization. It's Exchange and Lotus Notes and Gmail and God knows what you're going to ingest in the future. And again, this is very real scenario because today you could be typing away at your desk and be like, oh, that's fine. And tomorrow your CEO comes in and said, we just acquired a company that's on Gmail. Boom, you're in that scenario. My second thing, after verifying that the network is even up to par, is identities. Identities are the root of all evil, in terms of hybrid that is, but they are also the cornerstone for your deployment and the front door to your data. Needless to say, if someone steals my identity, i.e. knows my username and password, then they hold the key to the kingdom and they could do some really bad stuff to my tenant. That's why the first thing I do is enable multi-factor authentication. But I'm not here to talk about that. What I'm talking about is one of the other requirements. Remember the CEO came down to you and said, I want to see benefits early on. Well, one of these benefits in a hybrid deployment even has nothing to do with Exchange. The fact that you can exchange free busy, that's so 90s. You've got Azure AD. That single global directory you have there can unlock potential. You can use it for authentication in third-party SaaS solutions. You can use it to protect on-premises resources. But most of all, you've got a single global directory where all the other organizations are in. Single global address list. A single place where you can manage everyone. That is, in itself, the biggest benefit you can get right out of the door. And the only thing you need to do is set up directory synchronization. Or if you want, recreate all the users manually in Azure AD. All too often, I see that people neglect this benefit. Now, I just mentioned, you just sync those users up to to Azure AD. It isn't very hard, but how do you deal with multi-forest scenarios? In the scenario that we described, the holding with 4 companies, we had 2 Exchange organizations, a Lotus Notes organization, and an Office 365 organization. Well, all of them are very likely to have an Active Directory. Yes, even the Lotus Notes people use Active Directory. Not Lotus Note itself, but the organization probably has AD for other purposes. So the question that you have to ask yourself then is, are users, or do they exist in multiple organizations at the same time? If they're not, you're very lucky, because then your deployment, your identity synchronization between all the tenants became a lot easier. And this could be the case for you today. You are in hybrid, you are syncing up your data, that's great, and tomorrow you buy this company and you have to sync them up as well. Now you're presented with the question, how am I going to do this? Are you just going to connect that directory into Azure AD Connect and sync them up? Or Are you just going to find out that your CEO has an account in your forest and already had an account in their forest as well for the past 6 months while he was working on the acquisition or the merger or whatever it is? That's the real scenario. And does he still need that account in the other forest to authenticate to applications they have that you don't have? And maybe there's an entire business unit that has duplicate accounts and so forth and so on. This is a problem that you'll have to deal with. And I can't give you all the answers on how to do that because it really depends on the situation you have. Can you maybe exclude these accounts from being moved up to the cloud, i.e. take them out of scope for directory synchronization? Great, then you've got an easy solution. But perhaps you need the ability to move user accounts using ADMT between forests because there is a requirement for, moving between organization A and organization B, and you're going to keep the legal entities. Well, in that case, your AAD Connect, which can facilitate that scenario, your deployment became a little more difficult because now user accounts can be represented in both organizations. They are both in scope. So AAD Connect needs to understand which one is the master, right? Which one is actually the one that is going to contribute to Azure AD and which one it should neglect, in other words, right? So these are all problems that you have to deal with even in a hybrid deployment. And none of these have to do with Exchange. But you can't do Exchange hybrid without directory synchronization. As such, you can't do a merger and acquisition without thinking what you're going to do with it. And maybe the answer is, no, we're not going to take them in. We're going to move those user accounts into our forest, and then they will be synced up to Azure AD. Great. How are you going to take their data? How are you going to do their mailbox moves? That's something else that you have to think about, right? So in this scenario, what you see here is that company B was already synchronizing their identities. They don't have an Exchange server. Well, they do have an Exchange server on premises for management purposes, but they don't use it for any workloads on premises anymore. Then company C is synchronizing their third-party mail server directory with Active Directory, and then all of that somehow needs to get into Azure AD. Well, the company A, company C, and company D can then connect or hook into Azure AD Connect, and then from there you can sync up to Azure AD. Now, what you need to think about is the source anchor attribute. Again, if you do not plan on moving mailboxes across these, moving users, sorry, across these organizations, then you're fine, because by default, depending on how long ago you set up Azure AD Connect, the source anchor is more than likely to going to be the object GUID, right? The object GUID of your user account doesn't change in your forest. If you create a user in a different forest, or if you move a user across forest, that object GUID changes. Because essentially, you're creating a new object elsewhere. Which means that Azure AD Connect will then sync up to the cloud the deletion of that object and create a new one for the other forest. Which may not be the desired outcome, right? You might not want to delete the mailbox of the CEO when he moves from one legal entity to the other. So that's why you have to keep that in mind. Now, recently, I think it was April this year, the identity team made some changes where the default configuration for new Azure AD implementations uses the MSDS consistency GUID instead of the object GUID. It still uses the value of the object GUID, but writes in an attribute which is actually writable rather than read-only, which means that if you are in a scenario where you are shifting and lifting user accounts on premises, you don't necessarily run into the scenario where you disconnect a user when it moves across forests. But as you can see, we're only talking about one or a second forest, and then immediately we get faced with this problem, add a third, a fourth, or even a fifth forest, or one of the customers that I know has 122, then it becomes a little bit more complex than you would like or hope for, right? So as I said, the benefits of a global Azure AD tenant, which has its roots in the cloud, it supports Office 365, is to easily enable the collaboration, right? Unlock authentication capabilities across Office 365 and other third-party applications. Using Azure B2B, you can quickly start collaborating even on on-premises applications for as long as they support that, right? Azure AD supports industry standards OAuth. So if you have got applications on premises, rather than using the local Active Directory, you could try and envision those applications talking to Azure AD. So because you are in hybrid, because you have that global AD, you can now take advantage of that and quickly hook into other forests as well. How about authentication? multi-forest authentication. This is a really nasty one. For some reason, a lot of customers I talk to default to using ADFS. ADFS solves all our problems. I typically tend to challenge that and ask them, why do you have ADFS? And there's very good use cases for ADFS, don't get me wrong, but it adds complexity. It's kind of like the network thing. If you know how to manage ADFS, if you know how to maintain those servers, great. And actually, the thing is, Microsoft has made it so simple to get ADFS up and running, to get it integrated or federated with Azure AD, that everyone could do it. And everyone started doing it, not everyone, but a lot of people started doing it. But what if it breaks? What if? Do you all know what the claims pipeline looks like? How the authentication traffic goes through an ADFS server? What you need to do for troubleshooting? How you can enable debug logging on the ADFS server? How you can correlate events on the ADFS server? The answer to those questions for a lot of people is no. It's like, hell no. I don't want to. Rightfully so. So if the answer is no, and you cannot come up with a good reason on why to have ADFS, then why have it in the first place, right? Now imagine that you have ADFS, which, to be fair, if you are in a situation like this and you have on-premises applications that use ADFS, chances are that you want to reuse it in Office 365 as well. Great. But I don't want to have an ADFS farm here in this organization and one there and one there and one there, and I don't want to have to maintain an ADFS farm in every organization that I have. Ideally, I want to have a single ADFS farm that can do authentication across all forests. Great. As long as each forest or each organization maintains their single or their unique namespace, domain A, domain B, domain C, and domain D, that's fine. And then marketing comes along and says, well, I've got a great idea. Let's just rebrand all of them into company X. Oops. There is a reason why we suggest that you use your primary email address as your UPN, as the SIP address, because it makes it easier for the end user to authenticate and unlocks a lot of the, or takes away a lot of the complexity from an end user perspective. Let's just see what happens if you do that in a scenario like this. So you have user A and company A who's trying to authenticate, and there is a forest trust between company B and company A, and an ADFS server farm in the forest of company A. So the user goes to the ADFS server, or goes to the cloud actually, is redirected to the ADFS proxy, then to the ADFS server, and then authenticates to Office 365. So far, so good. We now have user B in company B trying to get to the cloud. So user B goes to the cloud, is redirected to the ADFS server farm, which is federated for companyb.com, and gets to the ADFS server. The ADFS server then talks to, not actually Exchange, but to Active Directory, and Active Directory will then look up how to authenticate the user. Now, because it has a forest trust, it will use companyp.com, the UPN, to look up in which forest to authenticate a user, and it will actually forward the authentication request to Forest B. Forest B will verify the credentials, if you will, craft a Kerberos token, and all life is good. It goes back to the cloud, and everyone's happy the user is in. As I then said, marketing comes along, and we now have holdingx.com. Great. So Forest A uses holding X. Forest B uses holding X. For all I care, Forest C uses holdingx.com as a UPN as well. User B goes to the cloud, then user B goes to the ADFS server. ADFS server talks to the on-premises organization, the internal ADFS servers, or Active Directory. What happens? Nope, wrong credentials. I have no clue who you are. That is because if you are in a scenario like this where you have multiple on-premises forests and you share the same UPN namespace across forests, then something called UPN suffix routing between forests is disabled. As such, the ADFS server, which is in forest A, can no longer authenticate requests for users in a different forest. It breaks. Solution. Oh, great. Let's go and build a new ADFS server farm. Well, hold on for a second. You can only have a single authentication endpoint, federated endpoint. associated to a domain. So how will the cloud know where to authenticate user B to if you all use the same external domain name? And this is in a scenario which a lot of people come up with, I know the answer, let's use alt logon ID. Ooh, gives me the shivers. It breaks other things. The experience you have, let's break it up in two things. The experience your end user will have with modern authentication is okay-ish. Using anything else but modern authentication triggers multiple authentication prompts because the user is prompted for authentication using ADFS. Username, password, using the UPN doesn't work, and then they have to use something which is called their explicit UPN or just the domain name WAC SAM account name in order to authenticate successfully. So these double authentication prompts are really problematic, right? That's why you want to stay away from stuff like alt logon ID unless you don't have another option. Anyway, let's talk some migration strategies. Right? Exchange on premises, hybrid or not. And what do I mean with this? You are still in your long-term hybrid solution. Great. You acquire that other company, and let's just say that you were company A and you just acquired company D, which is Exchange 2016 on premises. How are you going to move them into your tenant? Are you going to set up hybrid for them as well? Are you going to merge them into your organization on premises first and move them to the clouds? Reality is that the answer, again, is it depends. Can you do hybrid? Yes. Well, if that's 50 users, then please don't. Please don't. If it's 5,000 users, then you might want to do that. You can do multi-forest hybrid. That's fine. You can set up a hybrid there and set up a hybrid here. However, running the HCW in both organizations independently doesn't solve the problem of cross-premises collaboration. So there's still a lot of work for you to do between both organizations to enable the ability to have full, cross-premises delegation, if you will, if there is a forest trust, and I'm just talking about on-premises, right? Or are you going to use a third-party tool? It's another valid question, because realistically speaking, I think about 99% of the world runs on Exchange somehow, in some flavor of it. But what if you acquire a company that's running Lotus Notes? I'm going to go hybrid with Lotus Notes. Well, good luck. Can you do an on-premises migration for that company with Exchange and then go Exchange hybrid? Yeah. Why would you? I've seen some pretty weird things out there. And this is where there's a gap. Yeah, Microsoft offers that migration capability called an IMAP migration, where you could open up IMAP on the mailboxes in Lotus Notes and sync them up to the cloud. I'm terribly sorry, but that's not an enterprise-ready capability. It doesn't give me any coexistence. Not that I would want to, but it doesn't migrate everything. It doesn't give me the full fidelity, and it gives me a horrible end-user experience. Am I migrating 50 users? Great, let's do that. Am I migrating 5,000 users? I might want to rethink my strategy. I might even consider using third-party tools. I will consider third-party tools. I'm not going to lie to you. If I'm faced with something like that, then this is how you solve these problems. And there are some great tools out there. I'm not going to name them, but there are some that can really help with these specific use cases where you are in a multi-vendor solution on premises, where you are in a scenario where you're selling off a part of your organization. That's an even harder thing to do. Because in a long-term hybrid, and we're talking just about mailboxes because we're in an Exchange session here, but in a long-term hybrid, you might have data somewhere else. So Exchange can move a mailbox away. You can move it on premises, export it to PST, hand it over to whomever you sold that business unit to. But does it end there? The answer is no. Maybe you have legal requirements to maintain some part of that data. Maybe you need to ship it off to a different tenant. Maybe you are just splitting off part of your company, which is part of the same holding, and you're going to maintain their environment, but for legal reasons, they have to be in a separate environment. Can you do export to PST and then import into PST in a different Office 365 tenant? Yeah, you could do that. For 5 users, that's probably what I would do. I mean, it's done in a few minutes. Or you could, again, go to a third-party tool and do that. One thing, though, I want to talk about is you're in hybrid. And let's just assume you have Office 365, everyone is over there, and you just maintain a hybrid for SMTP coexistence, and because you want to offboard later, or you've got some management stuff going on. And you acquire a company also in Office 365. Now you are faced with problem 3, tenant-to-tenant migrations. For those who were in the session of just this morning, they showed how you could actually move mailboxes across tenants. Capability is not there yet, and it'll take a while before it comes. The problem there, too, is not just the mailbox. Let's just, fast forward a year and a half, and that capability exists. Yay! I can move mailboxes across tenants. Good. How about mail routing? How about public folders? How about groups? SharePoint? Anyone? OneDrive? Planner? Sway? Staff Hub? And I could go on for half an hour, but I'm going to do that. Reality is all those things are there. Even if you're just looking at Exchange, you're splitting off or you're ingesting a few mailboxes and they're using public folders. Great. I imagine that you could just move those public folders across. Are you ingesting the entire company? How big is that company? How are you going to maintain mail routing? Today, you can't share an email domain cross tenants. Domain A.com, domain B.com. Great. I just bought that company. Marketing comes along and says they need to be domain A.com. How are you going to do that? Sure, you can create mail-enabled users with a forwarding address to their tenants so that mail comes into your organization for domain A.com and is then forwarded to their tenants. So great, you'd solve the problem that they can receive as domain A. Will they be able to send as domain A? Nope. So you're still faced with that problem until you actually get them moved over to your tenant. And how long does that take to move people over? Can you do it in a weekend? Can you do it in a night? Do you need to do it over a course over 6-7 months? And this, again, is one of these scenarios where a third-party tool can help you, not just to move the mailboxes from one tenant to another, but also to deal with the scenarios on how to share an address space. Now, if you decide to go for hybrid, multi-forest, because that's the easiest way to maintain coexistence between both or the tenant and both Exchange organizations, then there's a few things that you need to keep in mind, right? Each organization should at least have one distinct SMTP address namespace to maintain or to identify both organizations. You must publish Auto-Discover, or the organization must be able to get Auto-Discover in each on-premise organization. You can do that in 2010, 2013, 2016, obviously, and 2019, I imagine so as well. You must use the latest version of HEW, but for none of us, this is really a problem because that's the only thing we should use today. The hybrid mess scenario stays the same, and just keep in mind that you couldn't go hybrid or multi-forest hybrid with multiple tenants because that creates problems of its own. You cannot run the HEW with one organization and multiple tenants. That's just not possible. Question is, can you move mailboxes without going hybrid? Yeah, it's called minimal hybrid in a way, but that opens up all sorts of other problems as well, and a lot of complexity. And in the end, in a scenario like this, in a long-term hybrid scenario, you want to drive down complexity. You want to stay in a situation that is as simple as possible so that whatever scenario is thrown at you, whether it is splitting off part of your organization, whether it is buying new organizations or merging with other organizations, you're not going to get into a situation where you cannot solve it technically. One last thing I'm going to talk about here today is in that long-term hybrid, are you going to use an edge transport server or not? I gave a 20-minute talk earlier this week, especially on this topic, on whether or not you want to use it. Just keep in mind that if you have an edge transport server in your organization, that can open up certain solutions. Where I was talking earlier about, well, how are you going to deal with inbound and outbound emails from company B being branded as company A? Well, there's transport agents you can deploy on the edge transport server that can do address rewriting. Am I saying that you should do that? Hell no. Because rewriting addresses on the fly creates a bunch of other problems, and it breaks other things as well, like your email security, for instance. So it's not something that you want to do, but in the short-term time that you're migrating or ingesting or merging companies together, that might be something that you want to look into. right? And then having the capability of doing so can be something that is really, really helpful. So this being said, I've touched upon all the things that I wanted to talk about. So there are a few other sessions this week, especially the one that was this morning, BRK3155, which is really interesting, contains a lot of the future of hybrid. So a lot of the problems that we discussed today, hybrid mess, cross-premises permissions, they will solve itself. Securely publishing an exchange, hey, they're working on it. Not being able to remove the lost exchange server is going to be solved. So basically, I don't have anything to talk about next year, so I'll have to come up with a new topic. But other than that, there are some interesting sessions this week on multi-geo. And why do I reference these sessions here now is, especially in a large hybrid deployment, long-term, chances are that if you are spread over the world, that you're going to face some regulations that might require you to have data in specific countries. So it is very important for you to understand what these capabilities can bring to you and whether or not these are something that you should consider, right? I'm definitely not in favor of saying, yay, let's do that. This is a solution to all your problems, because I'm pretty sure it is not. To me, the multi-geo is probably solving the data sovereignty problem, not necessarily any performance problems and so forth, right? So make sure to check out these sessions to get more detailed information, and obviously you can always get in touch if you have more questions about that. So this being said, I think we are at the end of the session. So if you have any questions left, feel free to ask them, and if not, thanks for being here, and I hope to see you next year.